Hello, this is Nathan Hedrick, pastor of Wayside Baptist Church in Anniston, Alabama. This is week 2 of our services in quarantine from the coronavirus. So we're kind of doing this a little differently than we normally would, and that's okay. We believe that God's not limited to the 4 walls of our church building, and He can still work, and we can still teach through YouTube or any other media that we have. But this is a kind of a trying time for all of us. We're kind of having to make sacrifices and step outside of our comfort zone and do things that we don't normally do. So this is an unprecedented time that we're going through right now. And so last week, our service, we had talked about how to have your faith in hard times and how to keep your faith during hard times. But this had kind of along the same lines. I had another thought that came to me this week, and just the thought that the church may be closed, but God is still working. And what I mean by that is just that, like I said, God's not limited to the 4 walls of our church. So I believe that God can minister through other methods other than what we think and what we're used to. And it doesn't have to be done, my way in order for things to work. As long as God's in it, God can use it. So just wanted to share something with you this morning along that thought there about God is still working. Even when we're not really seeing God working, or we may be going through times where we're not seeing God working in our lives. And that doesn't necessarily mean that God's not there or that He's not working. It just means that we're not seeing it, And so this is, I just wanted to give you the story of Joseph in Genesis. And everybody's probably familiar with the story of Joseph, and it's a very well-known story. But some of the things that we kind of overlook as we learn about this kind of stuff in Sunday school or in Bible school as a kid. So today I want to read to you from Genesis chapter 37 and verse 3 and 4. Leading up to this, just prior to these verses here, Joseph is basically, he's the father's pet, basically. He's the golden child, so to speak. It says that he was Jacob's favorite son. And also just prior to this, God has changed Jacob's name from Jacob to Israel. And so we hear it all throughout this passage. We hear both Jacob and Israel, but it's talking about the same person. And so in chapter 37 of Genesis, in verse 3, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him." So right now, this is kind of a bad thing, but Jacob has shown favoritism to Joseph. And we all know that doesn't work when you have more than one kid. You can't show favoritism, right? So that just kind of sets this all up. But he's given Joseph preferential treatment, and we see that he was kind of pet. He was probably a little spoiled. But it says that his brothers hated him so much that they couldn't speak peaceably to him. Now, that just means, if he walked by and said good morning, they didn't have anything to say to him. If he asked them, "Hey, I'm going to make a sandwich, do you want one?" They didn't have anything to say to him. They didn't have anything peaceably at all to say unto Joseph. They hated him that much. They just wanted him to go somewhere and die. And that's all they cared about with him, because they were tired of him getting preferential treatment. So that's kind of where we're at in this section of Genesis here, and we see that, and then if we skip on over to verses 23 through 36, in verse 23 it says, "And it came to pass, when Joseph was come unto his brethren, they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him." Now, he's been sent to his brothers by his dad to check on them and check on the flock that they're watching and everything. And so it's saying when he comes up to them, the first thing they did was they ripped that coat off of him. In verse 24 it says, and they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother, and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. And then there passed by Midianite merchantmen, and they drew and lifted Joseph up out of the pit. And they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 24 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. And Reuben returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes. And he returned unto his brethren and said, the child is not, and I, whither shall I go? So Reuben was kind of the older brother, and Reuben had talked to him and tried to convince him not to kill Joseph. And I guess he had went off for a little ways somewhere. It doesn't really say here, but it's saying that when he comes back to the pit and sees that Joseph's gone, he thinks they've already done something to him. And he's saying, how am I going to go back and tell Dad what happened? It says, and they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in the blood. And they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it unto their father, and said, this have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. And he knew it. And he said, it is my son's coat. An evil beast hath devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. And Jacob rent his clothes and put on sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I will go down into the grave unto my son, mourning him. And thus his father wept for him. And verse 36 says, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and a captain of the guard. So in this chapter, in this one chapter, I mean, not over a long period of time, but just in one chapter, we see Joseph going from being the favorite son. He's got preferential treatment. He's in good shape. Everything's perfect in his life. And now all of a sudden, he's being sold for a slave. And that's kind of a hard time. And I can imagine, Joseph is going through all this, and he doesn't really understand it yet, but God is actually working in his life. I mean, this isn't just a random story here. This is God working, and he knows that there's coming something else that's coming up, and that he's got a plan to save his people. But Joseph doesn't understand all that right now. Joseph is in the middle of the trouble, and he doesn't understand what's going on. He just knows that his world has just now been flipped upside down. And we feel that way in our own lives sometimes. We knew about this virus coming up, and it's been coming for a little while. We've heard about it a little bit on the news, but all of a sudden they closed down a lot of the factories. They've closed a lot of the stores and things that are jobs and stuff. They're not here anymore. There's a lot of people don't know if they'll have a job to go back to. There's a lot of uncertain times right now. We're living in an unprecedented time. We've never seen anything like this before, to where our whole economy is brought to a stop over a virus. And there's a lot of people out there that are losing money hand over fist in their stocks and in their retirement accounts and things like that. There's people that are sick and dying with this thing. There's all kind of things that are going on right now. And it's easy to look at this situation and say, I don't understand what God's doing. What is God doing, and why is God allowing this to happen to us? And that's kind of what happens to us most of the time when we're in a hard situation like that. We don't always know what God's doing, but we start asking questions while we're in that thing. And I can see, as Joseph is being taken away into Egypt, or he's being put into Egypt in a slave's position, and he's now having to work, I could see Joseph saying, hey, where is God? Hey, why is God doing this to me? Or why is God allowing this to happen to me? Or why do bad things happen to good people? And in addition to that, it's not enough that we question things in our own mind. The devil wants to use this as a situation to take advantage of the situation, of a bad situation, and make it even worse. So now, if you're a Christian and you're trying to serve God, and maybe you're trying to do all the things that you feel like God would have you to do, or whatever your situation may be, and now we're into these times where we don't know where our next paycheck is coming from and all that kind of stuff. And like I said, it's easy to say, hey, where is God and what is he doing? And we question God. And I think as long as we're reverent with that, I think it's okay. I think God understands that we're confused sometimes and we don't know the things that he knows. I think God understands that we're going to have some questions and all that. I think as long as we do it in a reverent way, I think it's okay. But it goes beyond that, right? People start getting mad at God. And that's where it turns into a sin. When we start getting mad at God and we don't trust God anymore, and when we start getting away from God in the hard times, and that's where we start having trouble. It's hard, But then, like I said, Satan's going to take advantage of this situation, and he's going to get on your shoulder and say, well, there isn't any God. Why do you even have faith in a God that would allow you to go through this? And why would you even want to serve God in this kind of a situation? Or you should just give up. You must not be good enough for God. God doesn't love you. You must not be good enough. And if you were good enough, God wouldn't be letting this happen to you. And I know that happens because I've had that happen to me before. It happens. It happens a lot. There's nothing the devil would rather do than to get us discouraged, get us cut off from our family, from our church family and things like that, and get us where we're isolated. And now it's even harder because we're in a situation where we have to be isolated. We don't have as much support from our church brethren and sisters than we normally would. We don't have that fellowship that we would normally have. And it's harder this way. But you know what? And this, and the devil will say, if this is Christianity, you shouldn't want any part of it. And a lot of people will be in this situation and they'll turn their back on God. They'll turn their back on their faith that they had before all this happened. But I'm here to tell you this morning that my God is the same today as he was 6 months ago before all this came about. My God is the same, and I don't have to worry about him changing today or tomorrow. I know that my God is still able to do all the things that he would normally do, and I still have my faith in him, and I'm not worried about all this. Sure, it concerns me. Sure, it's hard to understand. I don't get it. But at the same time, I know that God has some kind of a plan, and God is working even though we don't see it. And even though Joseph didn't see it in this story, God was working through his life. So if we skip on over, chapters 39 to 41, it kind of goes through a lot of the ups and the downs, and that's kind of the life of a Christian, right? We see a lot of ups and downs in our life. We have times where we're on the mountaintop, and then we have times where we go down into the valley. And we're up and we're down and we're up and we're down. And the thing is that we're supposed to have that Holy Spirit inside of us. And we've got to keep our faith to kind of moderate us. And even though life is going up and down, our faith has to stay the same. Our faith has to be there. And Joseph goes through, in these few chapters here, Joseph goes through 13 years of ups and downs. He works his way up from being a slave to being the overseer of his master's household, and then he's falsely accused and he's thrown into a dungeon, into a prison. He's mistreated there. And then one thing it just seems like nothing's ever going to happen good. But then just one day, Pharaoh has a dream and Pharaoh doesn't understand. And nobody in his kingdom can interpret that dream. But somebody says, hey, you know what? There's a guy in the dungeon over here that knows how to interpret dreams. There's a guy over here. We need to go get Joseph. So they go get him. He interprets the dream for Pharaoh, and then he's pulled right out of the prison, and he's made second in command of everything that Pharaoh has. He answers only to Pharaoh himself. Now, can you imagine in your life going in one day, going from a dungeon to the palace, going from the lowest person in the whole kingdom to the second highest person in the whole kingdom? I mean, it's a wild ride, you know, but that's the way our faith works. And sometimes we'll have the highs and the lows, but God is greater than the highs and the lows. God is greater than the ups and the downs, and our faith shouldn't depend on our circumstances. Amen. Our faith should depend only on what God has told us in His Word. So if we skip on over to chapter 42, verses 1 through 9, it says, now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, I'm sorry, let me back up. I've left out something, but in this time while Joseph is the second in command of Egypt, he comes up to a time when they're having a lot of plenteous harvest and everything, and they've got plenty of food. And the dream that Pharaoh had was a dream that there would be 7 years of plenty, and then there would be 7 years of famine. So Joseph told him, in the middle of all that, what we need to do is we need to store up what we've got during the plenty, and that way during the famine we'll still have food. You know, so that's what he's done, and now the famine has come upon the land, and it's all over the earth. It's not just in Egypt. It's the whole earth. And so now, you know, Joseph's father Jacob is back in his homeland, and he's having the same famine problems too. So it says, now when Jacob saw that there was corn in Egypt, Jacob said unto his sons, why do you look one upon another? He said, behold, I have heard that there is corn in Egypt. Get you down thither, and buy for us from thence, that we may live and not die. And Joseph's 10 brethren went to buy corn in Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, Jacob sent not with his brethren, for he said, lest peradventure mischief befall him. He didn't trust them, basically. He had one younger son left, and he wasn't trusting the older brothers to handle him the same way they did with Joseph. And it says, and the sons of Israel came to buy corn among those that came, for the famine was great in the land of Canaan. And Joseph was the governor over all the land. And he it was that sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brethren came and bowed down themselves before him with their faces to the earth. And Joseph saw his brethren, and he knew them. But he made himself strange unto them, and spake roughly unto them. And he said unto them, whence come ye? And they said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. Now I imagine Joseph probably over his time here in Egypt, you know, he had probably started to dress like an Egyptian and to look like an Egyptian. And we know from history, we can know that a lot of the Pharaoh and the royal people, you know, they had a certain way of looking. They had eye makeup on and weird things that a lot of other people didn't do back then. So I imagine Joseph did look a lot different than he did the last time 13 years ago when his brothers saw him. You know, he didn't look the same anymore. So they didn't recognize him, and he didn't tell them who he was. Instead, he tries to test them. You know, he wants to make sure that they're there for good purposes and not for spying or anything like that. So he accuses them of being spies. It says in verse 9, it says, and Jacob remembered the dreams which he had dreamed of them. So Joseph remembers that before he was sold into captivity, he had a dream where his brother and his father and all his family would come and bow down before him. You know, back 13 years ago, he didn't understand why he had that dream. But God had a plan 13 years ago to save all of his family. And to save not only his family, but basically a lot of people in that area that came to Egypt to buy corn. And he had that dream. And basically he didn't understand what the dream was all about, but God was still working through this situation to get him to that point, to get him to where that dream takes place and comes true. And so we see the same kind of thing sometimes in our lives where we feel like God has given us something to do, or we feel like God has done something in our lives, and we figure God's just going to continue doing all that, and we think God's just going to continue, and we're going to keep doing things the way we think it should go, but God throws a curveball every now and then. God doesn't work in the way that we would plan. He's not human like us, and His ways are not our ways. So when God decides to do something different, we may not understand it, but we still have to trust that God is still on that same plan, and that God is still working and doing the same thing that He was started out to do. And we still have to trust Him to do that, regardless of what it looks like to me at the time. I've got to get my eyes off of the situations and on to the faith. And I've got to keep my faith. That's the important thing here. Verse 9 says, And Joseph remembered the dreams which he dreamed of them, and he said unto them, You are spies, and you have come to see the nakedness of the land. And that's basically what he was trying to do. He was trying to trick or test them and see if they really were spies or if they really were coming to buy food. So he says that to them. Kind of a long story after that for a little while. He sells them the corn basically, and we see that God uses Joseph to save everybody. And we see that Joseph's family comes to Egypt, and they all, he reveals himself to his brothers, and he tells them, hey, and he's weeping, and he's sad that all that had happened, but he's not bitter at his brothers. And you think about that. You've been sold into slavery out of a favored position, and you're not bitter towards the ones that did it to you. That's not human. That's not something that's inside of us. That's something that comes from God only. That's not something that I'm capable of having that attitude. We get mad at each other. We get angry, and we start having a grudge, and we start holding grudges against people. But, Joseph didn't have that. Joseph had the attitude that God gave him, and Joseph had his faith in what God was doing. And Joseph knew that God was taking care of him some kind of a way in order so that he could do what God had prepared for him. And so Joseph, like I said, he gives them the bread, and they come to live with him there, and they live out the years of famine there in Egypt. And then it comes down to the point where Joseph's father, Jacob, dies. And so his older brothers think, well, now that Dad is gone, Joseph is going to hate us. And now that Dad's not here to stop him, Joseph is going to get revenge on us. And so in chapter 50, in verse 18, we see it says, His brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants. They're trying to apologize to him, and they're trying to get on his good side so he won't get revenge on him. Here's the key verse out of all this that we've been talking about here. Verse 19, it says, And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for I am in the place of God. He's saying that I'm in the place where God has put me. He's saying that I'm not mad at you for doing what you did, because I'm in the place where God wanted me to be. And if you hadn't done all this, I wouldn't be here today. It's easy to get mad at God for circumstances that we're in, and it's easy to get mad when our job isn't here, and I don't have any way to provide for my family no more, and all these things that are going on right now, and I could be mad at God. We could be mad at God when our health is gone, and when we have things that are going on that we can't control, and we could be mad at God. But instead, we've got to have the idea and the attitude in our head that God has put us in this place for some reason. Now, I'm not spiritual enough to know what that reason is, right? There's a lot of people that claim that they understand why God is doing what He's doing. I'm sorry, they're lying to you. Nobody understands why God's doing what He's doing. But what I'm saying is we have to have the faith to trust God when we can't see God. When we can't see what He's doing, we have to have the faith to trust Him, because that's what keeps us going, and that's what keeps us in the right place with God. And when Joseph said, "Hey, I'm in the right place here," and he says, "But he says, I'm in the place of God, but as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it to good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. He's saying that he understands that his brothers had a plan for evil against him, and his brothers had a plan to harm him and to get rid of him. And he understands that, and he's already forgiven them for it, because he knows that that's what it took to get him in the place where he could save all those people, all of his family, not just his family, but all the other Israelites, all of his whole family, not just the smaller family. So we can understand that God has a reason for these kind of things, and we don't have to understand that. So just in closing today, I just want to just go back over just briefly just a few things, but the thing is that the point is that sometimes God allows us to go through hard times, but that doesn't mean that God's not working in our life. We don't know what God's doing, and we don't know why. But that doesn't mean that he's not there working. And the key for us is to keep our faith during hard times. And don't get mad at God. We have to trust God. We have to trust him that he knows what he's doing. And even when we don't see the plan, we exercise our faith by trusting him to carry out that plan in our lives. Right now, our churches may be closed, but God can still work. God can still work even though we're not in our churches. Let me just give you this. Wayside, for people that aren't familiar with Wayside, our attendance is not very big. We're a small church. An average Sunday is 20 or so, 25 people. But, last week's YouTube sermon went out and has 84 views. Amen. Bless God. That is God working in a way that we would not normally see if we were not in the situation that we're in today. If we were in our church, we would never see that. And I'm praying that God can use these YouTube sermons to reach people that we normally would not be able to reach. And if he does, that's great. You know what? But if he don't, I'm still going to keep my faith. And I'm still going to go through my day-to-day life like I should. I'm still going to be right with God, and I'm still going to keep my faith in God, because that's what gets us through. And it's not just about the hard times. It's about the big picture here. This is a small, temporary thing. This isn't something that's going to last forever. In a few months, we'll probably be back at work and back at church and back to doing some of our normal things. But you know what? In the meantime, we have to trust God. So we need to understand that God is not limited to a church building. And God can work anywhere. So what does that mean? What can I do? What can I do as a member of Wayside Baptist Church, or any church for that matter, or anybody? What can you do? We need to try and stay in contact with each other. We have family and friends. We have church family and friends. We need to stay in contact with each other, because normally when we go to church or we go to visit our family, we have that fellowship and we have encouragement and things like that to help us get through our hard times. But now we're not able to do that. We've got to stay in touch. That means you got to call somebody. You got to send them a message somehow. You got to do whatever it takes to get a hold of somebody and try to stay in touch with them and to encourage them. We should encourage each other. And let me go ahead and say this. If you're struggling with doubt or discouragement or anything else in your life right now, don't be afraid to confide in your church brethren, your family. Don't be afraid to confide in your pastor or whoever, and let them understand that you're going through this and you're having a hard time. That doesn't mean that you're weak or anything. That just means you're human. We all go through that. Reach out to somebody. It doesn't have to be a pastor. It can be anybody that's able to pray and get a hold of God. But we've got to pray for our church family. And then we've got to pray for those that are outside of our church family. Because, like I said, God's not limited to working just inside the church. God is trying to reach out. God is trying to pull people into the church. We need to pray for those people, that they would respond to God when He calls them, that they would respond. We need to pray for everybody. And lastly, we need to pray for healing of the sick in this time that we're in, and for protection of the well. There's a lot of people out there on the front lines battling this thing. We've got EMTs, we've got paramedics, doctors, healthcare workers of all kinds. I mean, the people that aren't known, we don't know their names. We just know there's a hospital full of folks over there working. While we're at home trying to stay away from this mess, they're out there in this mess trying to keep people safe and to help people. We need to pray for those people. And that's everywhere. Not just here in Alabama, not just in New York where the hot spot is. We need to pray for those people everywhere, because this virus is everywhere. And things are happening. We've got to pray for protection. So that's just kind of all I've got for you this morning. I just want to encourage you to do these things, to keep your faith, and to pray for one another, and just to let God work and do what He's doing, and try not to worry about whether or not we understand it. Just try to keep your faith at an even keel, so that when the hard times come, we'll be fine. When the good times come, we'll be fine. We've got to keep our faith, and that's the main thing that I want everybody to get from this morning. This morning, and I want to thank you for watching this video, and God bless every one of you.